The Crooked Epic. 1. In. 1. The Inn of Maniacal Madness. 2. Ted. The Graveyard. 2B. 2. As Alex stood up on the platform, he did not make eye contact until he sat down on the chair at the other table. The anticipated planning committee was to take place right away, and as Clark followed him up, Ted knew they were recruiting only the top brass of their circle of friends. Last up of the two friends, Jacob, was about to determine the course to their heroic capture of the wild and untamed dog which had trespassed the marshaled neighborhood. Clark began to recant the tales from the radio news broadcast which followed the crew to their barn loft. Race wars, a bombing in the Midwest American schoolyards this morning, fascism and war in the fields of the European fronts last week, dangerously wild dogs in the good backyard. What's next? His remarks were supposed to be humorous, but only Alex sneered. At the time, Ted hadn't any idea what bombings there had been, their significance, nor did the insinuation of Mussolini's Charter of Labor register any recognition or relevance to him. Next, from the pause of their group and the tone of his exclamation, he could tell Alex was starting to announce the commands and orders for the dog hunt. Next, we split up and moved to both sides of the road at one time. 500 yards out, search for a trail, and return to post here, where we'll split up east and west, groups of two again, a mile hike out along the road on this side on the way out, the other side on the way back. Clark and Jake, you two go across the road. Ted will come with me in the back here. All right. Jacob was eager to get the adventure started. Clark echoed his confirmation, and the two started back down the ladder together. But as Alex began to mount the ladder to descend, he stared back up at Ted as he stuffed the books into his satchel. Ted turned to the window, watched the boys run toward the road, then walked over to the ladder and followed. Ted struggled to keep up with his brother through the backyards as he bounded through to the forest. Jacob started howling like a wolf across the road behind them, and he could almost hear Clark's laughter. Alex turned at the tree line to let Ted catch up to him and spun back around when he was within 10 feet. The dark shade of the woods was cool, and the pine-scented air was stale from the humid heat which encumbered the cozier barn loft climate. Brittle twigs and coniferous needles, small branches, and pine cones littered the ground past the layer of tall grass which cordoned the forest from the yard and past the first 20 or so feet of overgrown patches of grass. Some sparsely spread young saplings were another layer of the scrub, and thorn bush adorned with poisonous red berries and piles of dead leaves. These uninviting layers eventually gave out to the more traversable dirt, muddy leaves, mossy rocks, and exposed roots which continued into the massive forest's main body. None of the four were very experienced in trail marking, spotting, or hunting. Jacob's family had always hunted for wild game and deer, but he had never chosen to join them, and Alex was merely a novice at tying fishing lures and line tests, and they had no experience besides the rivers and lakes nearby. Clark's family had not even been involved in the military, but he was probably the most avaricious in the expedition. It was no surprise that none of them had found anything remarkable when they met up at the barn door on the return from their reconnaissance. Shitty. We didn't even see any dog shit, Jacob laughed. Clark showed his determination to continue the search, though. Yeah, let's get going. I bet if we finish another search, we could fit in another one before Jacob's dad takes us home. This seemed to make sense to Alex. We could time the searches a little and try not to make as much noise if we scared him off. Ted was becoming distracted by Mrs. Wilson's look of concern through the kitchen window. The older kids were in different stages of adjusting to the demands of young adulthood. Their self-importance and independence contrasted with their inexperience and undereducated intellects, resulting in the rebellious attitudes which he was sure Mrs. Wilson would find reproachful and uncouth. The others were unashamed and wild, but he was embarrassed for them. Alex must have sensed how Ted was unwilling to push forth for the bounty, so Ted wildly diverted the party's attention from his lack of enthusiasm for the search, which would have only given a reason to point at his suspected physical inability. Instead of agreeing in compliance with the urgency of the mission, sneakiness was the tactic he employed to regroup them for their afternoon ventures. Mrs. Wilson will probably get sandwiches ready for us. It may have seemed distractive, so he made his advice sound informative. She's our new babysitter. We should have one person gather lunch for us. Whoever is hungry, one guy stays here and watches the road through the barn window. The other two of us can split up on the sides of the barn to watch the backyard. That way we don't miss anything. Clark was impressed. Wow, I didn't think you had the lookout plan, Ted, but good stuff. The lad must have learned it from either Alex Harlow or myself. Chess champs. All right, you stay up in the loft, Clark. Keep an eye on the road and come down to get us when Teddy brings lunch out. Jacob can come back to the side of the barn with me. By the way, Jake, myself, and Clark already had a large brunch at Clark's house. Bring enough for all of us, though. Alex took back command. Clark climbed up the ladder, and Ted walked back to the side door with accomplishment and maturity which raised his stride. Once inside, he approached Mrs. Wilson with his chest raised and ready with confidence in his voice, where he had been anxious about her approval before. With the integrity he acquired from his inclusion and innocence conveyed from his desperation, Ted inquired about the schedule of their snacks. Mrs. Wilson, Alex and his friend sent me to ask you, when do we get to eat lunch? Mrs. Wilson replied that now would be a good time as it was almost 1:30, and she said that between noon and 2 would be best for them to gather with her to get lunches during the weekdays. Sandwiches of ham and cheese, soups when she could make it on the weekend, crackers and fruit. She explained that she would try to make the soup for them that afternoon when the weather cooled down. She also talked to Ted briefly about their meal routines, such as having eggs every morning except Friday when they could have oatmeal, and she assured him that they would have toast or sausage to go with the breakfasts. By the time she explained that she would do what she could to supply variety to the dining schedules, she was almost finished putting the array of peanut butter sandwiches on the trays for everybody. When her explanation began of the conservation of good meats for days when they did not have so many visitors, Ted finally interrupted her, only to say that they would want to eat outside today. Mrs. Wilson kindly agreed to the idea and asked if he would carry the water pitcher out for her to the yard. Ted grabbed the pitcher out of the pantry to fill with the water from the well, which sat in a barrel in the kitchen, and brought it out ahead of her toward the picnic table. Hey, lunch is on its way out. Everyone met at the picnic table. Clark came last through the barn. Where are the cups? What are we supposed to do with a pitcher of water? Pour it on ourselves? No, yet Clark had already grabbed the pitcher up. Luckily, the side door swung open, and Mrs. Wilson came out carrying a tray with sandwiches, a stack of plates, and cups. Clark sat with it down on the picnic bench. Surprisingly, Jacob and Clark seemed at ease, but Ted's brother seemed slightly repelled by the new babysitter. Mrs. Wilson walked back to the house, still smiling radiantly after setting the lunch down on the table, and they all began ravishingly grabbing at their plates and sandwiches. Ted turned to Alex and whispered to him, "Why do you not like Mrs. Wilson?" Jacob interjected, "There's nothing wrong with keeping peanut butter and jam separated." He started to imply his family's ignorant theory on segregation. Alex interrupted, "Is too." He sat up on the picnic table in front of the other boys. "Stop, it's not that. I just feel uncomfortable." They heard the rumbling noise of a car coming down the road. As the automobile became visible around the tree-covered corner of the property and over the high fence, Alex recognized it as their father's Lincoln. Up the driveway, their father was arriving much earlier than expected. He parked to the side of the barn door and was in a hurry toward the house. "Hi, boys," was all he said, and Mrs. Wilson returned out of the side door to greet him. They spoke under their breath, quietly in the afternoon, and as the boys munched on their sandwiches, the conversation was held secret. "Well, children, I'm going to have to split up the party. When you're all done eating, I have to drop off Jacob and Clark. Mrs. Wilson will stay here tonight," Father said as he walked back to the car and unpacked his work bag and briefcase. "All right, Mr. Good," said Jacob. "Thank you, Mr. Good and Mrs. Wilson," Clark added. "You're all welcome. I hope you enjoyed the sandwiches," said Mrs. Wilson, holding her poise and smiling at them with a comforting demeanor. She waited by the house while their father walked inside. After the father came back from the house, Clark and Jacob were done eating and ready to leave. They hopped into the car after saying goodbye and waved to the boys on their way out of the front gate. Alex and Ted were confused a little, but Alex managed to keep calm. He was a smidgen disappointed. Nevertheless, he did not need to be asked to help Mrs. Wilson gather the tray of dishes, and he walked inside behind her. Clark and Jacob had previously thrown a baseball up from off a shelf in the barn, and Ted noticed it when he climbed up to the loft where he started to sift through its earlier sketches. Encouraging himself to try to enjoy the day still, he decided the worthiness of their appraisal by Mrs. Wilson, so he packed up the bag and climbed down and went back. When Ted opened the side door, Alex walked from the front windows in the den room to the pantry. Alex opened the door behind him and left toward the barn as Ted entered the kitchen and saw how Mrs. Wilson was doing the dishes still. Sensing a change in mood, he altered his initiative and decided to take apart his book bag upstairs in his room out of everyone's way. Alex, meanwhile, went to the barn. After a while, as he took his seat at the desk in his bedroom, Ted heard Alex wailing insanely and yelling like a madman outside. When Ted looked out the window, Alex was rushing to their father at the side of the house, with Mrs. Wilson flying out behind them. He had fallen from the barn loft and had broken his arm. As soon as he got back, their father had to rush out again to bring him to the hospital, taking the rest of the day in and out of Concord's nearest emergency room facility. Alex came home later with a thick cast around his arm. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilson helped console Ted, who was afraid at first for his brother. He had never seen someone break a bone, and Alex's crying had been startling. Eventually, studying chess took Ted's mind away from the hectic moments, and he worked diligently at figuring out the chess strategy used by Clark in their infamous game 4 months before. Through the chapters on primitive techniques and fundamental basics of the game's history, a few clues aided the cause. Still, as he passed through the chapters on classic openings, he found out how he had used the English opening and Clark had used a Hungarian defense with the king castling by the 7th move. After studying past 3 o'clock, alone again, Ted heard the front door open downstairs. Yet undisturbed, he looked through the chess book still until the sound of their father's voice in the den room broke the silence of his studies. "I received word today that one of the prisoners I arrested escaped. I'll have to spend some time at the office for a couple nights. I'm sorry this was our first day having you here, but hopefully this doesn't reflect too poorly on us as a family. How is the day otherwise?" Straining to hear Mrs. Wilson's response, Ted stopped reading and entered a focused and intense trance, but he was still unable to make out quite exactly what was being said from there. Lost momentarily in his thoughts, he stared out of his bedroom window until he heard the pantry door open, and their father yelled up the stairs for him to come down to talk. Once more, glancing at the chess club book, to note the spot he had left off reading and marking it with loose paper. Ted yelled out to say that he was on his way down to them in a second. Father was talking to Alex as Ted walked down the steps, and he was forthcoming with directions for him. Ted, I told Alex that he can take whomever he wants on tomorrow's fishing trip, but he will need to have Mrs. Wilson go with him, so you may want to go too. Does this make sense? Of course, the whole trip was the most extensive plan for Friday. Ted was getting old enough to be all right at fishing. The prospects confused him more in excitement about their father's early return urgency. Okay. By the way, are you sure you want to go fishing? You can stay home with Mrs. Wilson tomorrow if you want to. Also, even though I'll be leaving tonight, you need to stay in to make sure Mrs. Wilson feels comfortable on her first day. No, I'm sure, Father. I've waited to go fishing all week.